Hello everyone. This lecture is going to be about research ethics. We have talked a lot about various different elements to research design and the types of information that it can produce and how important that is to actually improving our understanding of healthcare. However, research also has an element of interaction with society, and in particular, there is a relationship between researchers and the participants in those studies. And it's really important for us to think about and understand those power dynamics and roles. So as I said here, research doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is something that has an impact, a larger social impact. And we know that scientists and science are given a lot of power in our society in many ways, despite some examples to the contrary in terms of current policy making. But the truth is that simply by putting on a white lab coat, people actually treat you differently and will respond differently to what you ask them to do. So although we've discussed and we are aware of how crucial and important and beneficial research can be to healthcare practice, there are also potentially negative impacts as well. The three that I'm going to be focusing on here is research integrity. So was the research done in an honest way? Medical research, and then behavioral research. And then I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the current policies that exist for ensuring that this is done well. I would also say that this is an evolving process. Conducting ethical research is something that we are learning how to do better. And in my time as a researcher, I've seen how policies have actually changed, sometimes to make things more stringent, sometimes to make things more open to different types of research. And this is something that we really see as something that is a progressive thing that we can continually improve. All right, so something I should note here, and this is my caveat before I start this lecture. This is a talk that really focuses in on historical examples of research that has gone really horribly wrong. Now, the reason I'm doing this is that these examples really give us some insight into how research can potentially cause these negative impacts. But despite this, I want you to sort of keep in mind that this is not necessarily representative of all research. Most research that's out there is done in an incredibly ethical and careful way to avoid these potential harms. And that being said, these issues do pop up as certain types of issues do pop up in research over time. And these are the types of issues that we have to keep an eye on as we look at research and as we think about what types of research we're going to be doing. All right, so the first thing that I want to address here is research integrity. And that is essentially thinking about how honest was a researcher in terms of the approach that they used to doing research. In research, we actually give a lot of benefit of the doubt to researchers. We assume that people are presenting research that is honestly presented in terms of the results. And in fact, research as it exists can't be valuable without that assumption that the investigators are accurately presenting the information that they've collected. So, well, I'll actually go back. So the example here I'm going to talk about is the supposed connection between vaccine and autism. And, this photo is of crying children and the clinician with sores all over their hand, putting together a vaccine to inject those poor streaking children with. And this is really an idea and a concern that came out of Andrew Wakefield's 1998 Lancet study. Now, concerns about vaccines have been around for a very long time, and certainly there actually are examples in history of vaccines that were poorly made, that weren't tested properly, and that actually seriously harmed people and caused death. So concern about vaccine in of itself is not actually unreasonable. Additionally, this study and the type of thing that they were asking about, the possibility of connection between the vaccine and autism, actually was a reasonable question to ask at the time. There was some biological reason to start doing studies like this. However, that study in particular is notable because it was mostly falsified and misrepresented. And, there were falsifications related to the outcomes in the study. There was also misrepresented of the timeline where in the paper, they didn't report pre-existing symptoms. So the idea to vaccine causing autism is the assumption that the autism occurs after the vaccine. But if the participants in the study actually are experiencing autism symptoms before they were actually vaccinated, then that undermines the idea that it's causing autism. And this study actually misrepresented that timeline. There's also falsification of histopathology results. And they also didn't actually admit in the study that they actually recruited anti-vaccine activists who actually to be participants in the study. That's how they recruited their sample. And that is funded for the specific purpose of legal action against a vaccine company. So there were multiple concerning ethical lapses in this publication. And, that's, a clear violation of research integrity. Okay. Now, this paper actually was really pivotal in the creation of this thriving anti-vaccine movement, particularly around the MMR vaccine. This has dramatically changed the rates at which vaccination is conducted. In many places, we're seeing vaccination rates, especially here in Washington State, that drop below the percentages needed for herd immunity in certain areas. In fact, one of the worst places in the country is Vashon Island for vaccination rates. So what we see here is that we're seeing some epidemics of measles actually showing up in both the UK and the United States. Now, the increase in measles is a major concern, but another concern that I want to bring up with this issue around research integrity is that we have a lot of evidence showing that there's no connection between the MMR vaccine and autism, many studies. Now, what's important here, though, is that we have now spent a decade and millions of dollars and tremendous amount of research proving that there is no connection between autism and the MMR vaccine. Now, one of the major problems with this lapse in research integrity is that it sidetracked research on autism, which is a real challenge, into a direction that is entirely useless and that produced no additional information. Whereas all that effort and money could have been devoted to other research that could really help to understand better autism and potential ways of helping people with autism or potentially preventing it. So that's one of the major issues that you see with these types of lapses in research integrity, where you see people publishing papers that then throw the entire field off so that we can't actually follow up on really productive lines of research. What we also see is that there is this increase that we've seen over time in retractions of papers, scientific papers. And this has occurred for a number of different reasons. You could argue that it's because we have less funding, so there's more pressure on researchers to falsify data. I think that this trajectory also has a lot to do with the fact that, with the internet, we have and a range of different tools, we have a much better chance of actually catching data that was inaccurate. But there's other reasons that you sometimes retract papers, like scientific mistakes, etc. But we do see this increase in number of papers retracted for fraud and fabrication. So again, this is a major issue for science that we have to keep track of. All right, so let's switch and talk a little bit about biomedical research. So biomedical research has a long history of evolution in terms of research ethics. And, you are all aware of really the pivotal moment of this in terms of Nazi war crimes and the medical experiments during the Holocaust. And, these are really horrible experiments that were conducted on individuals in the concentration camps. Things like, injecting them with gasoline, doing live dissections, freezing people alive. So a range of different things that were really horrific things and deadly things that were done to people. Now, something in terms of research ethics and how we think about research that I want to point out in this context is that, some of this research that was done by the Nazis actually is data that we still use currently in emergency medicine. For example, how fast people get hypothermia and how they respond to it. So, there's an active conversation in research ethics around should we actually be using that data in medical practice, even though it was produced in an unethical way and a deadly way for the I wouldn't say participants, the victims of that research. So just something to think about in terms of the question of how research is produced affect how we should be using those results. The Willowbrook study is also an interesting study to think about. It was a study where Willowbrook was an institution for mentally disabled children, and the researchers in that study were interested in hepatitis. And in the process of the research, they actually learned that there was two types of hepatitis, hepatitis A and hepatitis B. They also learned about the possibility of vaccination. But the way that they did this was in part by actually deliberately infecting these children with hepatitis. There was also issues, clearly causing harm in that context. There's also issues in the fact that they did ask for consent from parents, but the consent wasn't clear exactly about what was happening. It was presented in a very positive way, as if we're helping them. And then secondly, it was also done in the context of part of their ability to access this resource for their children depended on them signing consent for them to be part of that research. So there's coercion in many ways connected in that research as well. And that's another thing that we think about in terms of research. Then there's a Jewish chronic disease hospital where they took patients who were non-responsive, and they injected them with live cancers. And at the time, they felt fairly sure that the body would reject those cancers, but they weren't sure about it. And again, we're talking about a population that is disadvantaged and that clearly can't advocate for themselves or consent in those contexts. Another case that I want to bring up is the case of Henrietta Lacks, and there's a very famous book that you can read that discusses this case in detail. But this is a case where ovarian cancer of a woman named Henrietta Lacks was taken as a sample and used to create the HeLa cell line. And this was done without any consent. And there's a lot of questions about when is it appropriate to take a sample like that without consent? And then secondly, some real concerns about that in the sense that we're talking about an individual that was taken advantage of in many ways, and her family wasn't notified, and there's a major racial component to this as well in terms of use of biological samples. Another study that brings up similar issues is the Tuskegee syphilis study. And this is a study, a public health-based study that initially started looking at a cohort of African-American men who were sharecroppers in the South in Tuskegee, and following the progression of syphilis in that population. Now, initially, when the study was created, there wasn't penicillin, so there was no treatment. However, after penicillin was found and they knew that they could actually treat syphilis with this, they actually did not treat the members of this cohort study, and they actually watched syphilis progress because they were interested in seeing what would happen if syphilis progressed for over a long period of time. Entirely unethical. Not only did they not treat them, they also deliberately and actively discouraged them from seeking treatment elsewhere where they could have been treated from syphilis. And this information about this broke in 1972, and we'll talk a little bit about what that led to. What really wasn't only realized until a few years ago, a researcher from Wellesley actually uncovered a finding that a similar study done by some of the same researchers was actually done in Guatemala. And that's a case where they actually both hired sex workers who had syphilis and also directly injected prisoners to study syphilis. And they did give treatment to some of those people who they deliberately infected, but it only appears that they actually treated about half of the people. So a large number, I think there was thousands of people who were infected through this study, and they've connected, I think, hundreds of deaths in connection with that study. And that was something done by the United States. I think Johns Hopkins and I forgot the other organization that was connected to it actually did this. Jesse Gelsinger is another case, example of biomedical research that went wrong, where this is a gene therapy study that was done, where Jesse Gelsinger was inducted into the study. He had a autoimmune deficiency, but he was perfect. He was generally, with treatment, was fairly healthy. But this new gene therapy trial was actually fairly dangerous, and he ended up dying as a result. And that brought up a lot of issues around consent. How much information should someone have about the risks that they are facing going into the study? And should we really be doing these studies with high risk with people who are actually fairly healthy and don't actually need these potentially really risky studies? Ellen Roche is a similar case where she had asthma, and they were testing this new drug, which, really they had very little information about. Some of the information actually suggests that it could be potentially really dangerous, but they decided to go ahead with the study anyway, and her lungs essentially crystallized over a period of several days, and she died as a result. And again, in the context of where she really didn't have the opportunity to effectively consent for this. So these are all just some examples of biomedical research where we have a range of different issues, from lack of consent in various different ways, to coercion, to really targeting individuals who are disadvantaged in various different ways through either education or ability to consent effectively, to questions around actually effectively assessing risks in these studies. So these are just some examples of the ways in which research can go wrong and kill people as a result. So those are, in addition to those medical research studies, biomedical research studies, there's also some lessons that we've learned from behavioral research as well that I think are relevant to thinking about health-related research. So the first study that I want to mention here is the Milgram study, and these two on the side are studies from social psychology. And the Milgram study is really fairly pivotal because it, first off, because it's very important, but second off, because it really emphasizes some of the risks that we didn't really recognize from behavioral research initially. So at the time, there really wasn't a lot of oversight of behavioral research because the risks weren't really understood. But the way that this study occurred was that they brought in white working class men in New Haven, Connecticut, and they told them that they were doing a study on memory, or on the ability to remember certain things and answer certain questions. So what they did is they brought in they falsified they created a false scenario where they took two people and supposedly randomized them to either being a student or a teacher. And the teacher had in front of them this switchboard, and they would read off certain questions, pairing questions, and whenever the student got wrong, they would administer a shock. And the experimenter was there, the researcher was there, telling them, the teacher, what to do. And what they saw, which was contrary to what they believed they would see from the study, was that every time the student got something wrong, the teacher would go up into a higher and higher level of shock. And what they found was that the teachers would go up to essentially a lethal dose of shock, whereas essentially XXX marked on the thing, so very severe shock. And they would hear, this wasn't actually true. The student actually wasn't hooked up to any electrode, but they would hear the sound of an actor yelling and things like that. And yet these individuals, which were just normal folks off the street from New Haven, about 60% of them actually went up to what would potentially be a lethal shock. And this was a complete surprise to the field of psychology, because they thought that people who would do these things would actually be sociopaths of various sorts. But what they found was that in an experimental context where the experimenter was talking about how important this was to research, very normal people would do things that we would normally think of as being unthinkable. And this research was really connected into understanding the Holocaust itself, in terms of why did people do things that we would normally see as being unthinkable. And this really emphasized the importance of context in terms of creating and forming behavior. So again, this brought up some real important ethical questions, because the individuals who are doing this, these teachers who are, potentially administering lethal shocks, well, they weren't necessarily doing it happily and willingly. Many of them were crying as they're doing. They felt like they were forced into doing this. Secondly, it brings up issue around deception in research. So they thought that they were doing one type of research, but it's actually it was actually false. The student actually wasn't hooked up to an electrode or anything like that. So they were actually being deceived about what they were there to do in their consent. So they actually weren't consenting to do this. And in theory, those teachers actually left that study with a certain type of self-knowledge, which is particularly potentially traumatic, to know that you actually potentially could kill people in these contexts. So, that is, an example of how behavioral research that we originally thought of as being something that wasn't necessarily risky actually could potentially have real risks. Another one, the Stanford Prison experiment, done in 1971, was also had a similar sort of element to it, in that essentially they took normal young college students and they split them out into prisoners. They created a fake prison. They split them out randomly into being prisoners or prison guards. What they found is that over a period of about 2 weeks, the people who were prisoners turned into behaving like prisoners because of the context, and the people who were guards turned into behaving like guards. And the prisoners became depressed and anxious and stressed out and disobedient and angry, and the guards became abusive and started essentially torturing the prisoners. And the researchers themselves were sort of watching this, in an amazed way, saying, well, look at this. This actually shows how context can actually create who people are. And they thought that this was an amazing experiment demonstrating that what we see in the prison industrial complex is, very much formed by the context in which people are put. And it wasn't until another researcher came in and they saw the prisoners being paraded by with bags over their heads, that this other researcher stepped back and said, hey, what you're doing is entirely unethical to these participants in the study, who were, clearly being harmed and were becoming depressed. So, these types of things, this is an example, and, the researchers realized that what they were doing wasn't appropriate and stopped it immediately. But this is another example of how a researcher sometimes can get caught up in their own research and their own interest in the question and forget about the impact that their research is having on their participants. Here's another example from an ethnographic study. So this is an ethnographic study which was called Small Town and Mass. It's a book that was produced called Small Town and Mass Society, Class, Power, and Religion in a Rural Community. So this is a researcher, a very famous researcher actually, who went to a small town in rural America and interviewed members of the small town about their opinions about things like class, power, and religion. And you know, the members of the community were very interested in being part of that. They talked to the researcher, and the researcher did which is accepted practice at the time. They published this book where they blinded who the person was. They didn't say who each person's name was, but did present, what people said. Well, what happened is that he published this book, and the people in the town who were very interested in the research quickly went out and bought this book. And as one might imagine, people's opinions about class, power, and religion was actually produced some fairly juicy statements. And the funny thing about being in a small town is you actually pretty quickly can figure out who's saying what about whom, even if you don't know their name isn't actually put in the book, right? And what happened in this town was the town exploded, essentially. And, a very large portion of the population, it was so bad that a very large portion of the population actually moved out of the town. It was just completely devastating to their local community, right? So again, a situation where the approach, the way of presenting this information actually had fairly devastating impacts on the community that was being studied. Tea-room trade in personal sex in public places is another example, and this one really gets at the questions of privacy in research. So this is actually a fairly pivotal study. So what the researcher did is they went to public parks where gay men were having sex, and the researcher pretended that they were a gay man and acted as a lookout for other men. And what the researcher was actually doing during this time was he was actually writing down the license plates of all the men who were coming in, and then he then went to the DMV, and this is illegal, but found out what the actual names were of all the men who were coming to the park to have sex. He then, later on, in the guise of just doing a normal survey, contacted those men and did a survey with them to assess their psychosocial well-being and various different personality traits and stuff like that. And the results of the study was that what he found was that these men were just entirely normal. That gay men at that time had been presented as being abnormal and sick in various different ways. And what this research actually showed was that these men were just normal people carrying out their lives, and and this actually had an important impact in terms of destigmatizing homosexuality, but it involved a major violation of participant privacy and deception in various different ways, and of course the illegal issues around pulling from license names from license plates. So again, a host of issues there. There's another study that was done in Barrow, Alaska, where they were looking. This is one of the northernmost towns in Alaska, and they did this study where they looked at rates of alcoholism, and they published this report which became very widely known about how alcoholism was really had an incredibly high prevalence in that community. Well, what happened is that this just became known in the entire state, in the entire area, in the community. And then people in the community in Barrow actually were stigmatized because of the expectation that they were alcoholics, right? So there was, again, the way in which this research that was designed around just providing descriptive information about risks actually had a stigmatizing effect on the community. All right, so, based upon, so these are all just some examples of the ways in which research can really go horribly wrong. And they're really helpful for starting to parse out and envision the ways in which we as researchers can make sure that we're actually protecting our participants. Now, one of the major ways that we want to do this as a community to improve research ethics for everyone is to actually codify those processes. And a major way that this is done is through actually having codes and expectations for how research is done. So after the Nuremberg trials revealed the horror of the Nazi experiments, there was really a push, international push, to create some sort of code around this. And that led to the Nuremberg Code, which is the first international code to sort of say that, you have to respect the autonomy of participants in the study, and that they have to have the right to have some sort of informed consent in those processes. The Tuskegee experiment, after it was revealed in 1972, led to the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research in 1973, which led to sort of our current understanding of research ethics that we currently use in terms of protecting participants through the institutional review boards. There's also codes that exist within professions. For example, the International Council of Nurses and the American Nurses Association each have codes of ethics related to research. And, in each of your subspecialties, it's very likely that your nursing organization, has its own set of ethics and ethical recommendations that you can look to sort of think about the different types of ethical issues relevant to the work that you might be doing. So it's important to sort of understand and think about those types of things, especially in the context of your profession. So the commission in 1973 led to the BELMONT report, which is the report that really led to our modern codes for dealing with research ethics that we currently use for research. So this BELMONT report was published in 1979, and it essentially laid out 3 basic principles for research ethics. And those are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So what are these? Well, respect is really the idea that you really need to treat individuals as autonomous agents. People can actually make decisions for themselves about what's best for themselves. And sometimes they'll decide that they want to contribute their opinions and, sometimes their bodies to help research progress. And sometimes they won't. And they should be allowed to make those choices. It also really, when we think about individuals and autonomy, to respect someone really means that you aren't just using people to achieve an end, right? That you're actually really respecting their own desires and needs and ability to choose. Now, out of this principle also really comes the ideas around giving extra protection for those who may have limited autonomy through maybe having limited choices to financial situations, or maybe having mental challenges, or maybe incarceration, or different types of things that limit their ability to make these choices. So beneficence is the idea that we really want to not do harm to our participants and to help people in general with the research that we're doing. Now, it isn't the case that research can never do harm, and I need to make that clear. So an example of this is that, sometimes we do randomized control trials where we need a control group. And if, for example, we need to do spinal taps for this study, well, we might have a control group of healthy people who are getting spinal taps. And, in a sense, they're being harmed. Spinal taps aren't fun. right? Now, in those situations, we really have to argue that the potential benefit is appropriate to the harm that they're experiencing. And secondly, that they really are consenting, knowing what they're going to be experiencing, and that they're willing to do this and go through this harmful experience for the overall benefit of research. However, in research, we really do follow, the ideas that we want to not do harm, that we want to prevent harm, that we want to prevent evil and promote good. Those, overall ideas of actually really helping people overall and helping society through the research that we're producing. It also relates really to the idea of carefully in your research balancing those potential harms against the benefits, and to really be honest as a researcher about how that balance plays out. So justice is the idea that in research we really want to treat people fairly. So some of those examples where I gave, Tuskegee experiment, where people were clearly not being treated fairly, they weren't given choices. You were targeting people who were already disadvantaged and had lower education, and this is a clear violation of justice, right? And there's a real principle here and a need here to do research that treats people in a just way. And really, one of the major elements to this is both a fair sharing of the burdens and the benefits of research, right? So, sometimes sometimes the burdens aren't distributed equally. So, those are situations where we have research which is done on people who are disadvantaged in various different ways. For example, research that targets people in prisons, right, where they might experience more of the burdens, and maybe in some cases, sometimes this research, they never might actually experience any of the benefits of that research. Now, this goes the other direction as well. So sometimes researchers haven't actually been careful in terms of making sure that everybody has access to the benefits of research. So these are cases where they aren't doing research on certain populations. So there's a big problem out there where sometimes very often researchers won't actually study children, even though children can benefit from knowledge about different health conditions. And therefore, they're using research on adults to actually make decisions about the health of children, which actually is in some ways an injustice. Another example of this is cardiovascular disease. For a very long time, they were doing all their research on men, and they're applying all the data that they got from men to women. Now, it turns out that the natural history of disease in women actually has some variation from men, and it took a long time to actually realize that because they weren't even bothering to do research among female populations. So in that sense, different populations can fail to benefit from research because there's no researchers doing research in that population. Now, when we think about justice, we also want to think about two different elements. So one is procedural justice, and that's just fairness. So do people have legal protections? Do they have processes? This also relates to consent, that is, consents that are legal documents in various different ways. The other view of justice, and that's part of what I've been talking about here, is distributed justice. So are the benefits and burdens being distributed fairly across a population? So how do we think about doing this in terms of applying in actual research? So beneficence, you really have to have a good research design, right? So if you are doing a study where it's actually a bad study and if you're doing a study that isn't valuable, that is designed in a way that's completely flawed, then you can never have a positive risk-benefit ratio. And that's because of the fact that if you can't produce good information, you can never have a benefit out of this study. So even if all you're doing is a survey, you're just wasting people's time. So it automatically has a negative risk-benefit ratio, right? So you have to have a good study to begin with. And that is the quality of research is actually a core element to research ethics in many ways. You have to have competent investigators who understand what they're doing and can understand how to prevent potential risk, understand the drugs that they're working with, understand how what they're doing could potentially harm people. And then there's also this way of trying to clearly parse out the risk-benefit ratio in a study. And that is actually challenging to do. And researchers really have to be honest and think carefully about, all right, what are all the potential ways that this could go wrong? And to actually know that so that they can actually convey that to participants and to the institutional review boards. Then respect, you really have to have informed consent. And informed consent is a really key question, because just having consent itself is not enough. For a very long time, researchers actually treated consent as something where they just put a paper in front of somebody and the paper was just complete legalese and nobody could understand it, and they just said, sign this, essentially, and then they treated that as consent. And so legally they consented, but the people who are making that decision didn't actually really understand what they were signing up for. And that really emphasized the informed element to this, that you really have to make sure that people are understanding what they're signing up for. And in my own career, I've seen how this has changed a fair bit. They've actually really cracked down on that practice. Now it's much more standard practice to have, careful processes for actually talking to people carefully to make sure that they understand what they're signing up for, and also using other methods than just signing a consent form. For example, doing a little presentation about all the different things and key elements to it. Respect also involves respecting privacy. So making sure that people's information is protected, that they're and that it's not revealed, so that their identities are, could potentially come back, that the information could come back and harm them or make them feel uncomfortable. Then we have justice. So justice really means equitable selection of participants in the study. Appropriately picking out procedures that are fair to different groups. Also making sure that there's legal protections there for the participants in the study. So this is a way of being fair, of making sure that everybody has an opportunity to both benefit from the study and that people across the population experience the burdens of it as well. All right. So in terms of how we regulate research in the United States, the organization that oversees this is the Office of Human Research Protections, and they do this through the 45 CFR 46 DHSS, which is a policy, which is the policy that provides an explanation of how we actually protect research participants. So this is actually implemented by institutional review boards. So you might have one at your hospital. We have one at UW. Different companies sometimes have access different IRBs, sometimes paid IRBs, and there's some ethic conflicts there as well that are interesting conversations going on right now. But these institutional review boards are essentially responsible for looking through applications to really assess whether or not the study that they're proposing has a favorable risk versus harms ratio. So they see that it's actually appropriate, that the study design seems to be appropriate, and that there is a real potential for benefit, and that the risks that exist are not too burdensome. Okay. They also look at things like protections of participants in terms of the ways in which their privacy and confidentiality is protected. And they also look at the consent process. How is that conducted? So one thing I'll note here is that these IRBs do their best to assess these studies and prevent unethical studies from going forward. And they really do see themselves as partnering with the researchers to help them to improve their study and their study designs to protect against these potential harms. However, it's also really important to note that really the researchers are the ones who are primarily responsible for the ethical conduct of their research. because first off, they're the ones doing it, and second off, they really should understand the research the best. And they're the ones who are most able of recognizing and avoiding potential harms from their research, okay? So here's just an example of what we do at the UW in terms of the various different things that we talk about in protecting participants. So the UW IRB will look at things like, are the risks reasonable relative to the benefits, all right? If there are risks, are there different ways in which they really tried to design procedures so that those risks are minimized, right? There's many different ways to do studies, and can we design this study well to make things less likely to be burdensome or painful or stuff like that? So they will talk about that in terms of asking you as a researcher to defend your procedures that may have harms or risks. They also look at things like privacy and confidentiality. So how have you designed your study to ensure that the data is protected, that you're collecting, that the names of your participants or the fact that your participants are part of your study is not publicly known, okay? They also have, for many studies where there's actually, especially biomedical research where there's potential harms, you often have to have a safety monitoring plan. And this is where you're essentially monitoring your data as you collect it to make sure that there isn't any undue or unexpected harms that are happening to the participants in the study. So it can be the case, for example, if you're looking at a drug that may have negative side effects, sometimes that maybe you didn't know about, that you can identify that before the study is done. Or if it becomes totally clear that there's no way that this drug is having any benefit and it is actually having negative side effects, well, sometimes they'll stop a trial early in those cases. The IRB also looks at things like informed consent. So do they have a process for doing it where there's a legally authorized representative to sign it? There are certain circumstances in which you can sometimes waive written consent in situations where there's fairly low risk. And there are certain cases, in fact, where you're looking at data that isn't directly collected from people, for example, secondary data, or in certain circumstances where you may actually not need to get any consent whatsoever. Usually those are cases where you can't actually identify who the participants are in the study. They also look at the consent process, and they sort of look to make sure that they're really addressing all the information that a participant would need to know about the potential risks, about what's going to happen, about their protections of various sorts, about their ability to withdraw at any time from the research, things like that. They also look at questions around whether or not the participant selection is equitable. So here's questions about whether or not you are using an approach that might be actually taking advantage of certain populations, populations perhaps with mental disabilities, or perhaps participants who are poor, for example, and they really need. You're giving a really high incentive to be part of the study, and it might be even coercive in those contexts. So here they're really thinking about is this accessible to a wide range of people, and do you have good justification for who's your sample? They also look at things related to if you have a vulnerable or protected population. For example, children, prisoners, pregnant women, who may be particularly vulnerable to the risks in a study, drugs or other types of things. They look there to see whether or not there's specific safeguards in place that can prevent these harms to those participants. And then there's other types of ethical issues that they'll look at, things like conflicts of interest. If the researcher has a financial interest in the company that they're working with, They look at things like, the relationships between different institutions and general compliance with various different health-related regulations. So that's what the IRB does. It's a fairly complex process. I have been on the NIAID IRB at National Institutes of Health, and I got to tell you, it's a really challenging process to be in these IRBs, and it's really taught me how important it is that researchers really are engaged and honest in this process. Because when you get these studies to review, every few weeks I would get a packet of paper that was actually 5 inches high. It was a massive amount of information. And of course, I went through it and did the best I could to get through everything. But it's hard to catch everything as an IRB. So really the onus on doing this well and really protecting your participants really does fall on the researcher. All right. So I just want to summarize here. Despite all the things I've talked about here, it really is important to remember the big picture that research does just have this tremendous potential to improve health and positively impact society. And in fact, it's really the only way that we will know with a great deal of confidence that changes that we make in healthcare are actually going to help people. However, it's also really true that these studies can potentially harm individuals, they can potentially harm communities, and in certain cases they can throw research off and harm the progress of research, both by violating trust in the research process and also by leading us in the wrong direction. So, the real important thing here is that as researchers, we really need to be thoughtful. We need to be modest about what we know and what we don't know. We need to include a lot of different people in the planning process so that we can really think about these ethical issues carefully and figure out a way that we can maximize the benefits of research for everyone. All right. Thank you very much. That's it for now.